Tonight you are exactly where you need to be. You've found your way to a quiet little corner of the night, where the world slows down, the stars begin to whisper, and soft stories drift like moonlight through the dark. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, I just want to gently ask, if you find comfort in these bedtime moments, it would mean the world if you'd take a second to like this video, subscribe, or even share it with someone else who could use a little peace. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing night after night. Now settle in, let the day melt away, and let's begin. The Weird Witch of the Willow Herb lived in a pink cottage on the top of a hill. She was merry and beautiful and wise and kind, and she was all dressed in pink and green, and she had great eyes that were sometimes filled with laughter and sometimes filled with tears, and her round, soft mouth looked as though it had done nothing but smile for hundreds and hundreds of years. Her pink cottage was the most charming place in the world to live in. The walls were made of the flower of the willow herb, and the roof was made of the green leaves, and the floors were made of the white down, and all the little lattice windows were cobwebs, spun by the spiders who live in fairyland and make the windows for the fairy queen's own palace. And no one but a wimp or a fairy could have said how long the weird witch of the willow herb had been living in her cottage on the top of the hill. Now, anyone might think that this wonderful witch was so sweet and so wise that all sorts of people would be coming all day long to ask her to help them, for, of course, that is what a witch is for. But this particular witch who lived in her pink cottage on the top of the hill had not been living there all that time for nothing. If I did not keep a few spells lying about at the bottom of the hill, I should never have a moment's peace, chuckled the witch of the willow herb. And that is why most of the people who came to ask her for spells never got so far as the pink cottage at all, for they found what they wanted at the bottom of the hill, and no doubt that saved everybody a great deal of trouble. Poor people, said the weird witch with her voice full of kindness. Why should I make them climb up all this way just to see me? Sometimes, however, it did happen that somebody got to the top of the hill, or else it is clear that this story would never have been written. For one day, as the witch sat on the doorstep of her pink cottage, looking out over the world with her great eyes that saw everything, the little Princess Winsome came running up the white path that twisted round and up until it reached the cottage at the top. And she did not stop running until she stood in front of the weird witch herself. She looked as though she must have come along in a great hurry, for she had lost one of her shoes on the way, and there was quite an important scratch on her dimpled chin. But of course, it is difficult to walk sedately when one is going to call on a witch. "I am Princess Winsome," she announced as soon as she had breath enough to speak. "To be sure you are," smiled the weird witch, who knew that before. and you have run away from home because I want to find the bravest boy in the world," interrupted the princess, who never liked to let anybody else do the talking. "Are they all cowards in your country, then?" asked the witch. "Oh, no," answered Princess Winsome. "The boys in my country are so brave that it is no fun playing with them. They stop all the games by fighting about nothing at all. And it's dreadfully dull when you're a girl, isn't it?" "Perhaps it is," smiled the witch. "Then why are you looking for the bravest boy of all?" "Ah," said the little princess wisely, "the bravest boy of all would never fight unless there was a reason, you see, and so we should have lots of time to play. But how am I to find him?" "The only way to find him is to let him find you," said the weird witch. "And the best thing I can do for you is to shut you up in the middle of an enchanted forest, where no one but the bravest boy in the world would ever come to find anyone. Now, make haste, or you won't get there in time." And the princess with the scratch on her chin must certainly have made haste, for she had quite disappeared by the time the witch's next visitor came up the winding white path, and that happened the very next minute. This time it was a boy who came along, a tall, strong, jolly-looking boy, with his hands in his pockets and his cap at the back of his head, whistling a strange wild tune that was made up of all the songs of all the birds in the air, so that, as he whistled it, every bird for miles round stopped to listen. "I am Kit the Coward," he said, pulling off his cap to the witch. "To be sure you are," smiled the weird witch, who knew that too. "And you have run away from home because the other boys called you a coward. And you want to show them that you are as brave as they are, only you won't fight without a reason, isn't that it?" "Of course it is," answered Kit, who liked to have his talking done for him. "But how shall I find something worth fighting about?" "That is not difficult," said the weird witch. "All you have to do is to go to the court of King Hurly-Burly and ask him to give you something brave to do. The king is always going to war about something, so you will soon have as much fighting as you want. Now be off with you, or else someone will get there before you." "All right," said Kit. "Which is the way?" "Any way you like," laughed the weird witch. "But in what direction?" asked Kit. "It doesn't matter," laughed the weird witch. So Kit made her another bow and marched away again down the hillside, whistling the same tune as before, and all the birds of the air came flying along when they heard it, and they flew in front of him to show him the way, and he followed them over meadows and streams and orchards and cornfields, until they brought him to the walls of King Hurly-Burly's city. And they would not have left him then if he had not pointed out to them, most politely, that although it was very obliging of them to have come so far with him, he would find it a little inconvenient to travel any further with so many companions. So they flew away again, and Kit marched into the city and up to the gates of the king's palace. "I have come to fight for the king," said Kit, when the guards came out and asked him what he wanted, and he looked such a fine, strong fellow, that they took him at once to the king. "You have come in the very nick of time," said King Hurly-Burly, "for the commander-in-chief of the royal forces has overslept himself so often that I had him beheaded this morning before he was awake. The army is in consequence without a head as well as the commander-in-chief. So if you will become their general and invade the country of my neighbor King Topsy-Turvy, I shall be much obliged to you." "Why have I got to invade the country of King Topsy-Turvy?" demanded Kit. The king pushed his crown on one side, which he always did when he felt puzzled. "Now you come to mention it," he said, "I believe there was a reason, but for the life of me I can't remember what it was. However, the reason is of no importance." "Oh, yes, it is," interrupted Kit. "I can't possibly fight without a reason, you know." "That's awkward," said King Hurly-Burly. "Perhaps the army will know." And he sent a message round to the barracks to ask the soldiers why they were going to war. But although the soldiers were all ready to begin fighting, they had not the least idea what the war was about. So the king's crown became more crooked than before. "Won't it do if you invent a reason?" he asked Kit, for he could not help thinking how nice it would be to stay at home while his soldiers were being led to war by someone else. "You may marry the Princess Winsome if you come back victorious," he added as an afterthought. But Kit only shook his head. He had never heard of the Princess Winsome, and he was not going to fight anybody without a very good reason for it. Then King Hurly-Burly had a brilliant idea. "Go and declare war on the enemy to begin with," he said, "and perhaps they will remember the reason." There was certainly no harm in declaring war. So Kit rode off at once on one of the king's fastest horses, and arrived the next morning at the court of King Topsy-Turvy, just as his Majesty was sitting down to breakfast. "I have come from King Hurly-Burly to declare war," said Kit, who always went straight to the point. "What for?" asked King Topsy-Turvy. "I don't know," said Kit. "That's what I want you to tell me." The king ate 2 eggs before he replied. "Well," he said presently, "I believe I said Hurly-Burly was a shocking old muddler. I suppose that's it. All right. When do you want to begin?" "I don't want to begin at all," answered Kit. "Why did you say he was a muddler?" "Oh, just to make conversation," said King Topsy-Turvy, helping himself to marmalade. "Then you don't really think he is an old muddler?" asked Kit. "Dear me, no," said King Topsy-Turvy. "I never think—" "Then write that down on a piece of paper and there needn't be a war at all," cried Kit. The king stroked his beard. "Perhaps there needn't," he agreed, "but I never write." "I do, though," said Kit, who had learned to write while all the other boys were making catapults. "You've only got to sign your name here." King Topsy-Turvy stopped eating his breakfast, just long enough to sign the beautiful apology Kit had written on a sheet of notepaper. And then Kit jumped on his horse again and rode back to the palace of King Hurly-Burly. "Well," said his Majesty, "did you discover the reason?" "There wasn't a reason, and there isn't going to be a war," answered Kit. and he held out the beautifully written apology from King Topsy-Turvy. "What?" cried His Majesty in alarm. "Do you mean to say you've stopped the war?" "Of course I have," said Kit, "and I have come back victorious, as you see. Didn't you say something about a princess?" "But," stammered the king, "how am I to appease the army? The army has set its heart on a war." "So had I," answered Kit sadly, "but I never can find anything worth fighting about. Meanwhile, where is the princess?" "You have not won the princess," said King Hurly-Burly, who was now thoroughly cross. "I believe you are a miserable coward." "That is what the other boys say," answered Kit, smiling. "It is not my fault that there is nothing to fight about. Will you please send for the princess?" "The princess has run away from home, so I can't send for her," said the king irritably. "She is shut up in an enchanted forest and surrounded with wild beasts and magic spells and giants. It is not at all a nice place for a princess to be in, but how am I to get her away?" "Why," exclaimed Kit, laughing, "here is something for your army to do. Let it go and rescue the princess." "Nothing would induce the army to go near the place," explained the king sorrowfully. "The army is too much afraid of being bewitched." "Hurrah!" shouted Kit, laughing more than ever. "At last I have found something brave to do. I will go and rescue the princess." So Kit the coward started out on his travels once more, and no sooner did he get outside the city gates than he began to whistle his wonderful tune, and down swept all the birds of the air in hundreds, and they flew in front of him as before, and led him to the very edge of the enchanted forest. There they left him, for no one can help anybody to go through an enchanted forest, and Kit knew fast enough that he must find the princess by himself. He was not a bit afraid, though, and he plunged straight into the wood without looking back. He had not taken 2 steps before he had completely lost himself. The trees were so thick overhead that not a streak of sunshine was able to get through, and the forest was so full of wild beasts that it was impossible to walk 5 yards without tumbling over a lion or a bear. But this did not frighten Kit at all, for he had learned to talk the language of the woods all the time that the other boys were knocking one another on the head, and so he soon made friends with every animal in the forest, and they told him the best places to find apples and nuts and blackberries, and the bees brought him the very best honey they could make, and he grew so happy and so contented that he quite forgot he was enchanted and could not escape if he wanted to. But it is impossible to be happy for long when one is bewitched. And one day Kit found himself in a part of the forest that was more horrible and more frightening than any dark passage that was ever invented on the way to any nursery. It was not only dark, but it was strangely silent as well, and a curious feeling of gloom and unhappiness suddenly crept over Kit. If it had been a nice sort of silence, the sort we find when we get away from the other boys and girls into a place where it is quiet enough to hear the real sounds of the air, Kit would still have been quite happy. But here there was nothing to be heard at all, not even the brushing of the leaves, nor the blooming of the flowers, nor the growing of the grass. But the most frightening thing of all was when he clapped his hands together and stamped as hard as he could on the ground, for not a sound did he make. And when he tried to speak, he found he could only whisper. And when he burst out laughing, he made no more noise than if he had been smiling. Still, he kept his wits about him, for of course there was the princess to be rescued, and at last he thought of trying to whistle. At first he could not make a note sound in the stillness, but he went on trying until the wonderful tune he had learned long ago from the birds themselves began to echo once more through the silent forest. He did not get an answer at once, for really nice birds cannot be expected to go out of their way to a place where there is no sunshine, and the flowers cannot enter into conversation with them. But after a while a very fat blackbird, who certainly had impudence enough for anything, came hopping along from branch to branch until he landed on Kit's shoulder, and with him came sunshine and sound and merriment into the very heart of the melancholy forest. For none of these things are ever far off when a blackbird is near. Kit gave a shout of joy and hastened after the blackbird, who was hopping along the ground in front of him. And the next minute he found himself standing in a blaze of sunlight in front of a high stone wall. Beyond the wall he could see the tall towers of a great castle, but he did not trouble himself much about the other side of the wall, for on the top of it, with the sunshine pouring all over her, sat the most charming little girl he had ever seen. She had lost one of her shoes, and there was the faintest sign of a scratch on her round, dimpled chin, and her long black hair flowed round her shoulders in a way that some people might have called untidy. But Kit was sure, directly he saw her, that she had come straight out of fairyland, and he was too amazed even to make her a bow. "Dear me, what are you doing here?" asked the girl in a tone of great surprise. Kit took a step nearer the wall and pulled off his cap. Her voice reminded him that, although she belonged to fairyland, she was still a little girl and would expect him to remember his manners. "I have come to rescue the princess," he said. "Can you tell me where she is?" "She lives in the castle over there," answered the girl. "What are you going to do when you have rescued her?" "Well, I suppose I shall ask her to marry me," said Kit. "Do you think she will?" "Ah," she replied gravely, "that depends on whether you have my permission. Tell me who you are to begin with." "I am Kit the coward," he said simply, and he stared when she broke into the merriest peal of laughter imaginable. "What nonsense!" she cried. "If you were a coward, you would never have got here at all." "Is that true?" asked Kit eagerly. "Then do you think the princess will marry me?" The girl looked down at him for a moment, with her untidy little head on one side. Then she bent and held out her two hands to him. "I think perhaps the princess will," she said softly. "If you will help me down from this enormous high wall, we will go and ask her." So Kit lifted her down from the wall, which was quite an easy matter, for it was in reality no higher than he was, and the little girl was certainly the lightest weight he had ever held in his arms. "What are you looking for?" he asked, when he had set her on the ground, for she was kneeling down and turning over the dry leaves in a most distressed manner. "I am looking for my crown, of course," she said with a pout. "It tumbled off my head just before you came, and I was too frightened to jump all that long way to find it." "Here it is," said Kit, and he picked up the little glittering crown and set it gently on the top of her beautiful rumpled hair. Then he started back in surprise. "You are the princess!" he shouted. "Of course I am," laughed Princess Winsome, putting her hand in his. "I knew that all the time. Shall we go home now?" Kit did not reply immediately, for no one can do two things at once, and it took him quite a long time to kiss the small, soft hand that lay in his own big one. And as for going home, when they did start, they did not get very far, for it must not be forgotten that they were still in an enchanted forest, and it is easier to get into an enchanted forest than to get out of it again. However, as they had everything in the world to talk about, they would probably have been most annoyed if they had found their way instead of losing it. So they just went on losing it as happily as possible, until they could not walk another step because an immense giant was occupying the whole of the roadway. There he sat, smoking a great pipe that looked like a chimney pot that wanted sweeping, and when the princess saw him, she was so frightened that she hid herself behind Kit and peeped under his arm to see what was going to happen. "Hello!" said the giant in a huge voice that made the grass stand on end with fright, just as it does after a hoar frost. "What's this? You're running away with the princess." "To be sure I am," said Kit, "and if you don't let me pass, I shall have to kill you." "Oh dear," sighed the giant, raising a wind that made the trees shiver for miles round. "They all say that, and there's no peace for a poor giant nowadays. When I was a boy, the prince was always put under a spell as well as the princess. However, I suppose I must make an end of you if you are determined to fight." And he laid down his pipe and rose most unwillingly to his feet. Kit laughed out loud with gladness, for at last he had found a good reason for a fight, and no one would be able to call him a coward any more. But before there was time to strike a single blow, the giant gave a loud howl of alarm, took to his heels, and in another moment was completely out of sight. Kit turned in amazement to his little princess, and then he saw what had frightened the giant, for all the animals of the forest, all the lions and the tigers and the bears and the wolves, stood there in rows, waiting to help him. So there is no doubt that that giant would have been killed by somebody if he had not run away. "Isn't it wonderful?" said the little princess in a whisper. But Kit covered his face with his hands. "It is no use," he said in a disappointed tone. "The other boys will never believe that I am not a coward." Princess Winsome came and pulled his hands away and laughed softly. "I think you are the bravest boy in the world," she said. "Of course he is," chuckled a voice somewhere near. "How stupid some people are, to be sure." And there sat the weird witch under a tree, all in her pink and green gown, with her great eyes brimful of fun and nonsense. And as the boy and girl stood hand in hand before her and caught the glance of her beautiful witch's eyes, all sorts of muddles fell out of their heads, and they began to understand everything that had been puzzling them for years and years and years. That only shows what a witch can do when she is the right sort of witch. "Dear little princess," cried Kit, "it doesn't matter whether the other boys believe me or not, so long as you know I am not a coward. Besides," added Princess Winsome, "we are not going to try to make anybody believe anything. I think we'll stay here instead, forever and ever and always." "A very good idea," smiled the weird witch of the willow herb as she nodded at them both. "Always remain enchanted if you can." So they had the nicest and the funniest wedding possible on the spot, and there was no time wasted in sending out invitations, for all the guests were already waiting there in rows, with the exception of the singing birds, and Kit very soon summoned them by whistling a few notes of his wonderful tune. The princess laid her own wedding breakfast under the trees, and the wedding guests helped her by bringing her everything that was nice to eat in the forest, such as roasted chestnuts and preserved fruits and truffles and barley sugar cane, and lots of dewdrops and honey drops and pear drops. And the weird witch completed the feast by turning a piece of rock that nobody wanted into a wedding cake. And everyone will agree that it is better for a rock to turn into a wedding cake than for a wedding cake to turn into a rock. And all the flowers came of their own accord and arranged themselves on the table, which they certainly did much more prettily than anybody else could have done it for them. And when the wedding was over, they just walked away again instead of stopping until they were dead, which of course is what they would have done at any other wedding. And although the bride had lost her other shoe by the time she was ready to be married, and although her beautiful hair was more untidy than ever, and her crown had tumbled off again and had to be brought to her by an obliging lion, Kit never noticed any of these things, and only felt quite certain that he was marrying somebody who had come right out of fairyland, and was not an ordinary princess at all. No doubt it was because he was in an enchanted forest that he made such a mistake, and no doubt it is because he has never been disenchanted since that he is making the same mistake to this day. As for the weird witch of the willow herb, she went back to her pink cottage on the top of the hill so as to be ready to make the next person happy who came up the white winding path. But before she went, she took care that all the singing birds should fly back to Kit's home and tell the other boys how brave he had been, which they did with the greatest pleasure imaginable. It is said that the story became slightly exaggerated, but when we know how much one little bird can tell, it is not difficult to imagine the kind of story that could be told by hundreds and hundreds of little birds. Little King Wistful slipped through the palace gates and went out into his kingdom to look for something new. He was only 8 years old, so he was not a very big king. But he had been king as long as he could remember, and he had been looking for something new the whole time. Now his kingdom was entirely made of islands, and in the days when the old king and queen were alive, these islands were known as the Cheerful Isles. But King Wistful changed their names soon after he came to the throne, and insisted on their being called the Monotonous Isles. For, strange as it may sound, this little king of 8 years old thought his kingdom was the dullest and the ugliest and the most wearisome place in the world. And nothing that his nurses or his counselors could do ever succeeded in making him laugh and play like other little boys. "Only look at the stupid things," muttered His Majesty impatiently, as he stood and surveyed his kingdom from the top of a small grassy hillock. 5 round islands in a row. Always 5 round islands in a row. If only some of them were square, it would be something. At the bottom of the hill was a wood, one of those pale green baby woods, where the trees are young and slender, and nothing grows very plentifully except the bracken and the heather. And as the king stood and felt sorry for himself at the top of the hill, out from the wood at the bottom of the hill came the sound of a little girl's voice singing a quaint little song. And this was the song: "Sing song, don't be long. Wistful, wistful, come and play. Sing song. It's very wrong to stay and stay and stay away. The world is much too nice a place to make you pull so long a face. It's full of people being kind and full of flowers for you to find. There's heaps of folks for you to tease and all the naughtiness you please. To sulk is surely waste of time when all those trees are yours to climb. Ting-a-ring. Make haste, king. I've something really nice to say. Ting-a-ring. A proper king would not make me sing all day." King Wistful thrilled all over with excitement. Was something really going to happen at last? He had hardly time to think, however, before the little singer came out of the wood into the open. She wore a clean white pinafore, and on her head was a large white sunbonnet, and under the sunbonnet were 2 of the brightest brown eyes the king had ever seen. He stepped down the hill towards her, wondering how anything so pretty and so merry could have come into his kingdom, and at the same instant the little girl saw the king and came running up the hill towards him. So it was not long before they stood together, hand in hand, halfway down the hillside. "Where did you come from, and who are you, and how long have you been here?" asked the king breathlessly. "I am Eyebright, of course," answered the little girl, smiling, "and I've been here always." "Who taught you to sing that song about me?" demanded the king. "The magician," answered Eyebright, "and he told me to sing it every day until you came. But you have been a long time coming." "I'm very sorry," replied His Majesty apologetically. "You see, the magician did not tell me to come. In fact, I don't even know who the magician is." "Are you not the king, then?" asked Eyebright, opening her great brown eyes as wide as they would go. The little king felt it was hardly necessary to answer this, but he set his heels together and took off his crown and made her the best bow he had learned at his dancing class, just to show beyond any doubt that he was the king. Eyebright still looked a little doubtful. "Then how is it that you do not know the magician?" she asked him. "What is the use of being king if you do not know everybody who lives in your kingdom?" "It isn't any use. I never said I wanted to be king, did I?" said His Majesty a little crossly. It was not pleasant to find that somebody else, and only a little girl in a sunbonnet, knew more about his kingdom than he did. "What a very funny boy you are," remarked Eyebright without noticing his crossness. "I always thought it must be so splendid to be a king, and to have a banquet whenever you like, and never to go out without a procession, and to wear a crown instead of a sunbonnet, and—" "That's all you know about it," interrupted the king somewhat impolitely. "There aren't any banquets, and when there are, you only have stupid things with long names to eat, and you never know whether to eat them with a fork or a spoon, and it's always wrong whichever you do. And if you ask for jumbles or chocolate creams or plum cake, you're told you mustn't spoil your dinner, and all the procession you ever get is a procession of nurses who won't even let you step in a puddle if you want to." "Dear me," said Eyebright, "you're no better off than a little boy in an ordinary nursery." The little king drew himself up on tiptoe with great dignity. "Some of your remarks are most foolish," he said. "You forget that I have a kingdom of my own as well as a nursery. To be sure," he added sadly, "it is not much to boast of, for it is a very stupid kingdom, and nothing nice ever happens in it." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Eyebright. "Your kingdom is the nicest kingdom in the whole world." King Wistful had managed to keep his temper so far, but this was more than he could bear. "Rubbish!" he cried, completely forgetting his royal manners. "You come up the hill with me, and I'll show you what a stupid kingdom it is." So they raced up to the top of the hill and looked down at the 5 round islands in a row. "There," said King Wistful. "Did you ever see anything so dull?" The little girl shook her head. "I think it is all as pretty as it can be," she said. "Look how the sun glints on the cornfields, and see the great red and blue patches of flowers." "But they're always the same flowers," complained His Majesty, yawning. "They're supposed to be the same flowers, but they never are," answered Eyebright. "If you were to pick them—" "Kings never pick flowers," he replied haughtily. "Perhaps that is why you know so little about them," retorted Eyebright, and His Majesty began to feel he was not getting the best of it. "Anyhow," he continued hastily, "you must own that the sea never changes." "Oh," said Eyebright, "that is because you have not learned the sea properly. It has ever so many different faces, and ever so many different voices, too." The king turned and stared at her. "Are you a witch?" he asked wonderingly. "No," laughed Eyebright merrily. "If I were, I would make you see things right instead of wrong." Then she suddenly scampered down the hill again. "Come along quick," she cried. "We'll go and ask the magician to disenchant you." King Wistful had to run his hardest to catch her, for the little girl in the sunbonnet certainly knew how to put one foot in front of the other. But then a sunbonnet is not so apt to tumble off a person's head as a crown, and that makes all the difference in a running race. "Where does the magician live?" he panted when he came up with her. "In the middle island," she answered. "We'll find the boat and follow the river down to the sea." She plunged into the wood as she spoke and threaded her way through the slender young trees, with His Majesty close at her heels. Sometimes the bracken was as tall as she was, but the boy behind could always see the sunbonnet bobbing up and down just ahead of him, and he followed it until they came out at the other side of the wood and found themselves on the banks of a charming little river. A small round boat like a tub, lined with pink rose leaves, was waiting for them, and into this they both jumped. "Oh, oh!" cried Eyebright, jumping up and down with delight. "The fairies are out today. Look at them, the purple ones in the loose strife, and the pink and white ones in the comfrey, and—" "You'll upset the boat if you don't sit still," interrupted the king, who felt cross because he could not see the fairies. "Let me have the oars, and I'll take you down the stream." "You need not do anything of the sort," said Eyebright, "for this is the boat the magician gave me, and it always takes you wherever you want to go." So they just sat in the sunshine and floated lazily along, and they dabbled their hands in the water and made their sleeves as wet as they pleased, and they caught at the branches above as they passed under them, and they leaned over the side and stretched after everything that grew out of reach. And, in short, if they had not been in a ferry boat, it is very certain that they would have tumbled into the water several times before they reached their journey's end. Presently the river widened out into the big calm sea, and after that the boat quickened its speed and took them across to the middle island in no time at all. For the fairies know well enough that nobody wants to dawdle about in an open sea where there are no tadpoles to catch and no trees that sweep their branches down to meet the water. When the boat stopped, they found themselves on the edge of a shore covered with sea lilac and yellow poppies, and wonderful shells that sang without being put to anyone's ear. And just a little way along the beach was the magician's cave. There was no doubt about its being the right cave, for over the door of it was written in square acid tablets, "This is the magician's cave." Besides, the whole cave was dug out of a solid almond rock, and, of course, any other person's cave would have been made of plain rock without any almonds in it. "Come along," said Eyebright, and the two children walked up the beach and knocked at the magician's door and went in. Some people might think that a cave on the seashore would be full of draughts and jellyfish and wet shrimps, but this particular cave was just like the nicest room that ever belonged to a castle in the air. The wonder of it was that whoever went into it found the very things he had never had and always wanted, and none of the things that he had always had and never wanted. So Eyebright immediately found a beautiful storybook with a colored picture on every page, and all the sad stories squeezed between the happy stories, so that no one who read it could ever cry for long at a time, while the king found the inside of a clock waiting to be picked to pieces, and an open pocket knife with a bit of firewood lying handy, and a full-rigged schooner ready to be sailed. And they both saw the dear old magician, sitting in his armchair and smiling at them. He was dressed in a long cloak, that always began by being a green cloak, but changed every other minute to a different color according to the mood the magician was in. And as he was always in a nice mood, whether it was a sad or a merry one, his cloak always managed to be a nice color. On his head was a high-pointed hat with crackers sticking out of it, and a pattern worked all over it in caramels and preserved cherries, and he wore furry foxgloves on his hands to keep them warm, because he was not so young as he used to be. He had been practicing as a magician for over 1,000 years, but he did not look very old for all that. He was what might be called pleasantly old, for he had soft white hair and a curly white beard and a pink complexion like a schoolboy's. That is how a magician grows old when he has always been a jolly magician. Dot Eyebright ran straight up to him and climbed on his knee and hugged him. "I've brought the king to see you," she announced, "and we want you to be a nice, kind, lovely magician and help him to be disenchanted." The magician stood up and shook hands with the king, just to make him feel at home, and the boy did not feel shy another minute, and quite forgot that he had never paid a visit before without a procession of nurses to look after him. "You are very good children to call on me at tea-time," said the magician. "If there is one thing more than another that makes me feel the ache in my bones, it is having tea by myself. Now, would you like to have it on the floor, or shall I call up a table?" The king, who had had his meals on a table all his life, voted for the floor. But when Eyebright said it would be more fun to see what would happen if they chose the table, he had to own that perhaps she was right. What happened was very simple. The magician just stamped on the floor, and a neat little table, covered with a nice white cloth, walked in at the door like any person and took up its position in the middle of the floor. "Well," exclaimed Eyebright, "I never knew tables could walk before." "What do you suppose they have 4 legs for?" asked the magician, smiling. "My nursery table does not walk," observed the little king. "Ah," said the magician wisely, "some tables do not know how to put 2 and 2 together. Now for some chairs." He stamped on the floor again, and 2 little armchairs bustled into the room as fast as their fat little legs would carry them. "You must excuse their being in such a hurry," said the magician. "They have been playing at musical chairs all their lives, you see. Now, while you are laying the table, I will boil the kettle, crockery in the left-hand cupboard, and eatables in the right-hand cupboard." So the magician set to work and lighted the fire with peppermint sticks, and the 2 children opened the doors of his wonderful cupboards. The crockery in the left-hand cupboard was the right sort of crockery, for none of it matched. So it did not take a minute to find a small pink cup and a green saucer for Eyebright, and a big blue cup and a red saucer for the magician, and a nice purple mug without any saucer at all for King Wistful. As for the right-hand cupboard, the little king was overjoyed when he found it stocked with jumbles and chocolate creams and plum cake. "I am glad," he said with a sigh of relief, "that you don't keep seed cake in your cupboard. Seed cake always reminds me of 11 o'clock in the morning." "Ah," said the magician. "The wymps saw to that, when they filled my cupboard for me centuries ago. There's never any bread and butter in it either, until you've had as much plum cake as you can eat." That was a delightful tea party. The magician did not mind in the least when they made polite remarks about the food and told him his jumbles might have been kept a little longer with advantage, or that his chocolate creams were not quite so soft as some they had known. But they hastened to add that his tea was the nicest tea they had ever tasted, because it had only a grown-up amount of milk in it. So he would have been rather a cross magician if he had minded. Nor did he raise any objection when they walked about in the middle of tea and took a look at the picture book, or whittled away the piece of firewood, or danced round the cave and shouted because everything was so nice. And after tea there were all the magician's treasures to be turned out of odd nooks and corners and left about on the floor, and all his new quill pens to be tried, and his clean sheets of note-paper to be scribbled over. And when they were tired of exploring the cave and had eaten as much plum cake as they wanted, the magician saw it was the right moment to begin telling them really true stories. And as he was a magician, of course, his true stories were all fairy stories, which, as everyone knows, are the only true stories in the world worth believing. But even the stories came to an end at last. And then both the children remembered at once why they had come to see the magician. "Well, what can I do for you?" he asked, before they had time to say anything. For truly, he would not have been a magician at all if he had not known what they were thinking about. He smiled so encouragingly that the little king answered him at once. "It's like this," he began. "There's something wrong with the way I see things." "Of course there is," said the magician. "The wymps threw dust in your eyes when you were a baby, and you cannot expect to see things in the same light as other people when the wymps have once thrown dust in your eyes." "Why did they throw dust in my eyes?" asked Little King Wistful. "Usual reason," answered the magician briefly. "They were not asked to your christening, that's all. If people will persist in leaving the wymps out when they give a party, they must take the consequences. However, as you were not to blame in the matter, the wymps would be the first to own that you ought not to be bewymped any longer. The best thing you can do is to go up to Wympland yourself and ask them to take away the spell." The little king looked at Eyebright and hesitated. "It is a long way to go all alone," he remarked, and Eyebright immediately stepped up to him and took his hand. "I'll come with you," she said. "I've always longed to go to the other side of the sun. How are we to get there, magician?" "Well," answered the magician, "the usual way is to climb up a sunbeam, but that's not very quick, and sunbeams are apt to be slippery in the dry weather. Shall I send you up in a flash of lightning or on the spur of a lark?" "Spur of a lark," echoed the king. "You mean on the spur of a moment, don't you?" "Not a bit of it," answered the magician. "You'd never get up to Wympland on the spur of anything but a lark, I can tell you. You have to get up there very early in any case if you want to be even with the wymps, so the best way is to rise with the lark. However, as it is getting rather late in the day for larks, I had better send you up in a lightning flash. Will you manage it alone, or shall I send a conductor with it?" "Would the conductor show us the way?" asked Eyebright. "Dear me, no," said the magician. "Lightning conductors never show anything but the stupidity of some people. Perhaps you'd better have the lightning without a conductor. So stand on one side while I pick you out a nice quiet flash without any thunder hanging to it." He took down a large sack labeled "Storms" from the shelf, untied the top, and plunged his head into it. Eyebright stole a little closer to the king than before and hoped that nothing would go off with a bang. "I say," said His Majesty, putting his arm round her, "it strikes me—" "That is impossible," interrupted the magician in a stuffy voice from the middle of the sack, "for I've got it in both hands, and it isn't going to strike anybody so long as you treat it kindly. Now off you go in a flash." And off they did go in something, though they never knew what it was, for they had no time to see anything before they found themselves dropped with a thud on the other side of the sun. For a moment or two they just lay where they had fallen without moving. Then they sat up and rubbed their eyes and looked round. "Oh!" exclaimed Eyebright, clasping her hands tight. "I had no idea it was like this." Of course, Eyebright knew no more about Wympland than she had learned in her geography lessons, and we all know how little geography books ever tell us about the really nice places in the world. So, although she knew as well as any other little girl that Wympland has no physical features and its inhabitants have no occupation, that its climate is dull and foggy and its government is a sleeping monarchy, she was not in the least prepared for what she did see. "Well," said a voice somewhere near, "what do you think of it?" Just in front of them a wymp was standing on his head, which is a wymp's favorite way of resting his legs. He seemed to expect an answer, so the king did his best to think of one that should be both polite and truthful. As a matter of fact, he did not think much of Wympland at all. It is rather full of fog, isn't it?" he began, a little nervously. The wymp looked distinctly hurt, but before he had time to get angry, Eyebright put things right in her quiet little way. "I don't think it is yellow fog," she said. "It is more like dull sunshine." The wymp fairly wimpled when he heard this. "You've hit it!" he cried in a delighted tone. "That's what it is, really. It's the folks from the front of the sun who call it yellow fog. They're blinded by their own sunshine, they are. This is the back of the sun, you see, and the sunshine naturally loses a bit of its polish by the time it is worked through. I think I like bright sunshine best," observed the king. "That is absurd," said the wymp. "Why, you can't look at it without blinking to begin with. In Wympland you get all the advantages of the sun and none of the drawbacks. No sunblinds or sunstrokes or sunspots. You must be a stupid boy if you can't see that." "It is your fault, not mine," answered the king boldly. "You shouldn't have thrown dust in my eyes if you wanted me to see Wympland in the right light." The wymp turned several somersaults to show his amazement at the king's words, and finally stood thoughtfully on one leg. "That's serious," he said. "We didn't know you'd ever come up here, or we shouldn't have done it. However, it can't be helped now, so you'd better go back again. It doesn't matter if you do see things wrong at the front of the sun." "But it does matter," they both exclaimed. "And that's why we want you to take away the spell, please." The wymp stood on his head again and shook it from side to side, which no one but a wymp could have done, considering the awkwardness of the position. "There's only one thing to be done," he said at last. "You must exchange eyes." They stared at the wymp and then at each other. The little king began to think busily, but Eyebright spoke without thinking at all. "Very well," she said. "How is it to be done?" "Quite easy," answered the wymp cheerfully. "All you've got to do is to wish with all your might to have the king's eyes instead of your own, and there you are." At that moment the king finished his thinking. "Stop!" he shouted. "If I take her eyes away, she will always see things wrong." But the king had spoken too late. Eyebright had already wished with all her might, and her eyes had turned as blue as deep water, while his majesty's were round and large and brown. "What fun!" she cried, laughing happily. "Isn't it a nice change to have somebody else's eyes?" The little king, however, was far too furious to listen to her. "Stand up and let me knock you down," he cried, shaking his fist at the wymp. "Look what you have done. She will see things wrong to the end of her days." "Don't be a foolish little boy," said the wymp calmly. "Take her home and try to see things right yourself." The king certainly did not take her home, nor himself either. But it is the truth that they both found themselves, the very next minute, standing on the top of the small green hillock and looking down at the kingdom of the monotonous isles. "Hurrah!" shouted King Wistful, waving his crown joyfully. "What a beautiful kingdom I've got! Look how the sun glints on the cornfields, and see the great red and blue patches of flowers. Don't you think it is a beautiful kingdom?" he added, turning to the little girl in the sunbonnet. Eyebright was distinctly puzzled. She thought she only saw 5 round islands in a row, but of course it was impossible that the king should be mistaken. So she looked once more over the kingdom of the monotonous isles, and then back at the anxious face of the little king. "Yes," she said softly, "it is, as you say, a beautiful kingdom." Then she ran down the hill and disappeared among the slender trees of the baby wood, and little King Wistful went home to bed. There is a queen now as well as a king of the monotonous isles. She has black hair and blue eyes, and she wears a crown instead of a sunbonnet, and she quite agrees with the king whenever he tells her how beautiful their kingdom is. And if this should seem remarkable to some people, it need only be remembered that the queen sees everything with the king's eyes. And now, as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.